Everyone doubted the teen who collected rusty water tanks, until the drought came by. The time Ethan Walker chained the 12th rusty water tank onto his trailer, people had stopped asking what he planned to do with them. Now they simply laughed. Every abandoned dairy, every forgotten cattle pasture, every rusted tank leaning against an old barn wall, half swallowed by John Songgrass. Ethan asked the same quiet question each time. Mind if I haul that off for you? Most owners were relieved someone finally would. The tanks leaked. Some had holes the size of a fist. Others hadn't held a drop of water in 20 years. To everyone else in Kado County, they were scrap metal, waiting for a truck to take them to the yard. But Ethan always ran his hand across the rust before loading each one, as if he wasn't seeing what the tank had become, but what it still could be. He was 16, quiet in the way that made people forget he was in the room. He didn't argue, didn't explain himself, didn't need to be right out loud. He just kept working. And in the back pocket of his jeans, worn soft at the corners, he carried a weathered black spiral notebook that never left his side. What is he building? Nobody in town could say, not even his own father. Western Oklahoma doesn't forgive carelessness. The Walker farm sat on red dirt and rolling prairie, where the wind never really stopped and the sky went on longer than seemed fair. Mark Walker had farmed that land his whole life, same as his father before him, and he'd learned the hard way that some summers the rain simply doesn't come. That was the trouble eating at every farm in the county that year. The pond behind the Dawson place was down 2 feet already, and it was only June. Wells that used to run steady were sputtering by August. Irrigation costs had doubled. Everybody talked about the weather, the way people talk about a sickness they can't cure, with worry dressed up as small talk. Mark noticed his son's notebook long before he understood it. At supper, Ethan would scribble numbers between bites. Rainfall totals, roof measurements, barn dimensions, slope angles, sketched in pencil with little arrows showing which way water would run if it had somewhere to go. "What is all that for?" Mark finally asked one evening, nodding at the notebook. Ethan shrugged. "Just keeping track." "Of what?" "Everything that goes to waste." Mark didn't understand yet, but he let it go, the way a tired father lets go of things his son isn't ready to explain. Ethan was never disrespectful, never lazy. He fixed the tractor before being asked. He fed the cattle before sunrise. If the boy wanted to haul rusty tanks around instead of watching television like other kids, so be it. The neighbors weren't so patient. Carl Dawson, 63 years old and set in every one of his opinions, watched Ethan's trailer rattle past his fence line one morning, stacked with 3 more leaking tanks. "Boy's going to open a junkyard," Carl said to no one in particular, spitting into the dirt. "Rusty tanks, Lord." He laughed about it at the feed store. Other men laughed with him. Nobody laughed at Ethan directly. He wasn't the kind of boy who invited cruelty, but the whispers followed him anyway. A good-natured kind of doubt that still stung, if he let it. He didn't let it. He kept collecting. Ruth Bennett lived alone at the edge of town, in a house with a garden too tidy for someone her age, most people said. She'd spent 30 years as an agricultural engineer before retiring, designing water systems for co-ops and small towns across 3 states. Most folks in Kado County just knew her as that woman who waters her tomatoes different than everybody else. Ethan found her by accident, hauling a tank past her property when hers happened to be the 10th stop of the day, and his trailer axle groaned under the weight. And she was out front, adjusting something plastic and precise near her garden beds. "You are collecting those for scrap?" she asked. "No, ma'am." She studied him a long moment. Something in the way he'd answered, quick, certain, no explanation offered, made her set down her trowel. "Show me the notebook," she said. It wasn't a request most teenagers would honor. But Ethan handed it over without hesitation, like he'd been waiting years for someone to ask. Ruth flipped through the pages slowly. Rainfall dates, roof square footage, runoff estimates scratched out and recalculated. She said nothing for a long time. "You're thinking about harvesting rain," she finally said. "Not collecting it in a barrel, actually harvesting it." Ethan nodded. "Do you know how much water hits a barn roof like your daddy's in one good storm?" he told her. The number wasn't exact, but it wasn't far off either. Ruth Bennett didn't smile easily, but she smiled then. She never gave him answers straight out. That wasn't her way. Instead, she asked questions that forced him to think harder than he already was. If your first tank overflows, where does that water go? If sediment builds up in your line, what happens to your pump? How do you keep water clean for 6 months without a filter? Ethan didn't always have answers. That was the point. He'd go home, sketch new diagrams, test new ideas, and come back the following week with something closer to right. Nothing about it came easy. If you're watching this and thinking Ethan simply built something perfect on the first try, that's not how real water systems work, and it's not how his did either. The first tank he restored, patched with sheet metal and sealant, held water for exactly 4 days before a seam split open in the night. Ethan woke to a flooded yard, and a father who wasn't thrilled about the mud tracked across the porch. He didn't quit. He studied the seam, learned what he'd done wrong, and reinforced the next one properly. Then came the overflow problem. Nobody had told him, because nobody but Ruth understood yet what he was trying to do, that a tank without a proper overflow route becomes a flood hazard the moment it fills. His second attempt sent runoff straight into the equipment shed. Mark wasn't happy about that one either. Then algae. Stagnant water left uncovered in July heat turns green fast, and Ethan learned the hard way that stored rainwater needs a first flush diverter to keep debris out, and needs to stay dark and sealed to stay usable. One of his tank stands, built from scrap lumber, collapsed under the weight of a full tank during a windstorm, sending 200 gallons across the barnyard in a rush. Winter brought a different lesson. A pipe he hadn't insulated properly froze solid in January, cracking a fitting he'd have to replace come spring. Each failure cost him time. Each one taught him something a book never could have. Ruth used to say it plainly. A system that's never failed is a system nobody's tested hard enough yet. Slowly, piece by piece, tank by tank, Ethan's system began to hold. It arrived on a Thursday in April, the kind of spring thunderstorm that builds slow over the horizon and then breaks all at once. Lightning cracked over the wheat fields. Rain hammered the tin roofs so loud you couldn't hear a conversation across the porch. For most of Kado County, it was just weather. Water running off roofs, down driveways, into ditches, gone within the hour. Same as always, not on the Walker farm. Ethan stood under the barn overhang, soaked to the shoulder, watching gutters funnel water into pipes he'd installed himself, watching tank after tank begin to fill. 12 tanks, connected by gravity, each one catching what would have simply washed away. By morning, when the storm had passed and the prairie steamed under a pale sun, Ethan had captured almost 9,000 gallons of water that would have otherwise disappeared into the red dirt. Mark walked the length of the tank line that morning, quiet, running his hand along the same rust his son always touched. "You built all this," he said. It wasn't a question anymore. For the first time, the county began to understand what the boy had actually been building. By July, it was the worst dry spell Kado County had seen in decades. The Dawson Pond, once full enough for cattle to wade into on hot afternoons, cracked at the edges like old paint. Shallow wells across the county began sputtering, then failing outright. Pastures that should have been green by midsummer turned the color of straw. Farmers who'd laughed about rusty tanks the year before were now paying to haul water in from town, watching their budgets shrink alongside their ponds. On the Walker farm, something different was happening. The vegetable garden stayed green. The young fruit trees, planted just 2 seasons before, held their leaves. The cattle trough stayed full, fed by gravity from tanks that had been sitting quiet and full since April, untouched by evaporation because Ethan had learned, the hard way, to keep them sealed and shaded. Word travels fast in a small county, especially when it's about water in a drought. Carl Dawson drove over one afternoon in his old pickup, dust rising behind him the whole way down the dirt road. He didn't say much when he climbed out. He didn't apologize either. That wasn't Carl's way. He just looked at the tank line a long moment, then at Ethan. "I've got 6 old tanks behind my barn," he said. "You still want them?" No apology, just respect, and somehow, that meant more than an apology ever could have. What started as one boy's quiet project spread, slowly, the same way rain spreads across dry ground, soaking in, before anyone notices the change. Ethan started helping neighbors set up their own systems. Old rusty tanks that had sat forgotten along fence lines for years suddenly had a purpose again. Ruth Bennett came out of retirement, in a way, teaching small groups of farmers what she'd once taught one curious boy alone. The county extension office paid a visit that fall, asking questions, taking notes of their own. A few months later, a teacher brought her students out to see it firsthand. Kids standing in a half circle around 12 tanks that used to be nothing but rust, listening to a 16-year-old explain gravity flow, first flush diverters, and why storage capacity matters more than luck ever will. If you've ever watched a drought take something from your own family's land, you already know why this story matters. And if you're watching from somewhere far from Oklahoma, somewhere that's never known a dry well or a cracked pond, maybe this is the first time you're learning why farmers like the Walkers plan years ahead of the storms that haven't come yet. Tell us in the comments where you're watching this from, and if you've ever lived through a drought or a season where the rain simply didn't show up when you needed it most. Tell us that too. Somebody watching right now might need to hear that they aren't the only one who's been there. 1 year later, the county looked different, not because it rained more, because people started preparing before the rain stopped. The rusty tanks had never really been worthless. They had simply been waiting for someone willing to imagine rain before the clouds arrived. Sometimes, the future isn't built during a drought. It's built years earlier. One forgotten piece at a time. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and stay with the Farmland Files, because the next quiet idea that changes everything might be one story away.